welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we look at what's really going on in the world of the BRICS. Now, on January 23rd, 3 days after his inauguration as US President, Donald Trump called on the OPEC countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, to lower prices, and he expressed surprise that they had not done so prior to the US elections. Why, I don't know. It's in their interest to have higher prices, not lower. Trump's strategy involves using lower oil prices to persuade Russia to suspend the special military operation and negotiate the fate of Ukraine, while the US is maintaining its leverage over Moscow. Well, it hasn't actually got any. Now, the basis for this strategy is the hypothesis that lower prices, as experienced in the 1980s, had a negative effect on the Soviet Union. However, this theory is not supported by empirical evidence. Plus, Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan, Vladimir Putin's not Mikhail Gorbachev, and Russia's not the Soviet Union. Things are very different. Well, addressing the leaders of OPEC countries directly, Trump was speaking live in Davos via satellite. In addition to the peacekeeping and peace aspects, his proposal had anti-inflationary elements. He said, following the decline in oil prices, the world's central banks may begin to reduce rates. He said if oil prices decrease, the threat of inflation will decrease and central banks will be able to loosen the reins of their monetary policy. Now, the markets were not impressed and they only showed moderate reaction. Oil prices experienced a 1.5% decline, but that was the extent of it. Now, before I continue, I'd like to make an appeal. If you like and enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and my website, SCOBRICSInsight.com, to further develop it. And you can do this by making a small donation, which is done by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen. Everybody who donates does get a personal thank you from me. So, the question is of whether this was part of a broader conspiracy similar to that happened between Reagan and King Fahd of Saudi Arabia that remains a point of interest. I mean, it is possible that Trump's statements were influenced by that conspiracy theory that seems to think that was the decisive act of the Cold War in the 1980s, as it was the actions of the then US President Ronald Reagan who convinced Saudi Arabia to radically increase production. This in turn is said to have led to a significant drop in oil prices below $10 per barrel. I mean, at current prices, by the way, that would equate to around $29 per barrel. Now, this fall in prices was an unfortunate development for the Soviet Union at the time of perestroika, as the petrodollars they earned from the oil helped pay for vital imports, including high technology. Now, the USSR's trade balance and budget began to deteriorate, and which, among other factors in this context, primarily led to ultimately to its collapse. Now, in Russia, this theory enjoyed widespread popularity among all representatives of the political persuasions in the 1990s and then into the 20s and the 2010s, often being perceived as a fact. And the US also attracted a number of supporters, including Reagan's adopted son Michael in his memoirs. More recently, the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, Andriy Yermak, alluded to the theory, suggesting that the US should adopt a similar approach now to support Ukraine. Now, a detailed account of this theory can be found in a book by the political consultant Peter Schweitzer, Victory, the Reagan administration's secret strategy that hastened the fall of the Soviet Union. Notably, it was highlighted that in 1981, during a visit to Riyadh, the CIA director William Casey broached the subject of the US and Saudi Arabian security, as well as the potential for increasing Saudi oil production. According to Schweitzer, this interaction may have signalled the presence of a coordinated strategy at a later stage. However, this theory doesn't actually hold water. Firstly, in 1981, prices were performing strongly and stabilising around their all-time high. Now, while there was a slight decline in production in the following years, it was significantly less than the worst decline which we experienced in the second half of the decade. Now, OPEC's discipline at the time was not optimal, with many of its member countries attempting to circumvent the quota systems by various nefarious means, resulting in a significant oversupply in the market of oil. Now, this behaviour led to a decline in OPEC's overall effectiveness and attempts by Saudi Arabia, who was the organisation's de facto leader, trying to restore discipline met with very limited success. Now, if you look at the available data, you'll actually see that the Saudis had been reducing their production for several years around then. And it's not as dramatically as at present, a couple of million barrels below the record levels. But nevertheless, it was in a sustained manner. I mean, from 1981 to 1986, the country's oil production fell from 10 to less than 4 million barrels a day. Now, a reversal occurred in 1986 following a scandal during which representatives of the organisation, Iran and Iraq, which were at war, were warned for violating their export quotas. Now, Riyadh was growing weary of relying solely on its own efforts to keep the global prices high, leading to increased production. However, there was no indication of a return to previous levels. But over the subsequent 2 years, production volumes rose to 5 million barrels per day, and that was only half the previous peak. Now, according to Schweitzer's theory, the Americans' response to Riyadh's actions could be divided into two possible scenarios. Either they were pleased with the Saudis' leadership and increased production, or they were outraged by their lack of decisiveness. However, both assumptions don't actually add up. In reality, Reagan dispatched George Bush Sr., that was his vice president at the time, who later went to become president and father of George W., on a mission to persuade Saudi Arabia to return back to the status quo. Now, the reason for this is as follows. This was due to the damage that even a modest effort by the Saudis had inflicted on the US oil industry. This period witnessed a decline in the US oil industry, and that continued until the late 20s. Now, Bush bluntly informed King Fahd that increasing Saudi production posed a direct threat to US national security. Yeah, that old chestnut again. Appears that anybody who does anything in the world that the US disagrees with is a threat to US national security. Now, it's important also to note that the Soviet-American relations at that point began to improve after meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev, Gorbachev being the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's Central Committee, and the meetings took place in Geneva and Reykjavik. Consequently, Soviet oil production was at its peak, a notable distinction from its American counterpart, which had been operating at a loss throughout the 1980s. Now, despite the decline in prices, which was a significant blow to the Soviet economy, oil production still remained at a plateau of 12 million barrels per day for the next few years, and it only started to decline again in 1990. Now, this decline was not solely attributed to the historic decline in prices, which had occurred against the backdrop of the Iraqi-Kuwaiti conflict, but the broader crisis afflicting the Soviet economy. I mean, while the USSR did experience a decline in oil prices in the second half of the 1980s, it would be inaccurate to attribute this solely to the primary cause of the Union's collapse, as there were numerous other contributing factors. Plus, of course, Saudi Arabia did increase production, but that was not a determining factor in the eventual decline and fall of the Soviet Union. So the notion of a coordinated effort or a cunning plan by Washington and Riyadh is suggested is somewhat divorced from the actual historical events. I mean, the Saudis increased production only slightly, and they were extremely reluctant at the time to do so. And the US was not at all delighted by this, rightly fearing the consequences for its own oil sector. Now, the decisive factors in the decline in world prices were the development of energy conservation in the largest economies, as well as a lack of discipline amongst the other OPEC countries. Now, the current situation in the world is not the same as that of the 1980s, but there are some similarities. In both instances, there's a lack of strong incentives for either the US or Saudi Arabia to reduce prices. I mean, the Saudis have voluntarily limited their production for the last few years and will continue to do so. That's in order to balance the kingdom's budget's ambitious targets. I mean, oil prices, they need to be between $90 and $100 a barrel. In the US, falling prices pose a significant challenge to their shale oil industry, as they did 40 years ago. Most US fields are only profitable at the price point of a minimum of $60 per barrel. And this is evidenced by the fact that prices have remained at these levels or above since the pandemic. So the plans for large-scale drilling and increased production in America will conflict with the pressure on OPEC to reduce prices. So in conclusion, it's evident that Trump's proposals are just more hot air and actually not meant to do anything apart from Trump being Trump, bombastic and boasting again. Nothing serious. And it's certainly not going to affect Russia's attitude to negotiations. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. And if you want to help me out, click on the thanks button at the bottom of the screen and make a donation. And I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.